our text this morning, Paul is writing his second letter to the church at Corinth. Paul is proposing that he will make a second visit with them. But Paul lets them know something. That this time when he comes to see them, his attitude is going to be vastly different. When Paul went to them the first time on that first visit, he was depressed. He was gloomy. But he promises the Corinthians something. He says it's going to be different this time. He's not going to be shrouded in gloom and miserable and utterly and totally depressed in spirit. He's not going to be a gloomy Gus. He's not going to be a negative Nelly. You know, when I think about people who are pessimists, people that are glass half empty people. You know, you've always heard about glass half empty people and glass half full people. Well, actually, I'm a glass that's full person. Even if it's only half full, it's still a full glass because the top half's filled with air. So it's a full glass. But when I think about pessimistic people, I think about a story I read one time about two farmers that were neighbors. One of them was always looking at the positive side of a situation, and the other one was always looking at the negative side of things. The optimist would say, man, this sunshine is great. And the pessimist would say, yeah, but I'm afraid it's going to scorch the crops. The optimist would say, man, that's a fine rain we're having. The pessimist says, yeah, but I'm afraid we're going to have a flood. Well, one day these two farmers that were neighbors, the optimist said to the pessimist, have you seen my new bird dog? He's the finest bird dog money can buy. The pessimist says, you mean that mud I saw pinned up behind your house? Didn't look like much to me. He said, well, let's go hunt. So the two men went hunting the next day. Took the new bird dog. They shot some ducks. The ducks landed in the pond. The optimist ordered his new bird dog to go get the ducks. The dog responded obediently. But instead of swimming, the dog actually walked on top of the water, retrieved the ducks, and came back. That optimist turned to his pessimistic friend and said, now what do you think of that? The pessimist said, can't swim, can you? Well, Paul says, I'm coming to see you, brethren, at Corinth. But I'm not going to be that guy when I come this time. Guess what? Any preacher with a gloomy spirit is going to impart that same spirit more or less to the congregation of people that he's preaching to. And Paul says, when I come to you the next time, don't be afraid that I'm going to come like I did before. Paul says, I've learned better. I've learned that pessimism is worthless. I've learned that gloom ties you up and defeats you. When I come the next time, I'm not going to come in that spirit of gloominess that caused you so much sorrow when I was there the last time. Now understand something. Paul does not mean to say that there is no occasion for depression and wringing of the heart. There's actually good reasons for that in the Corinthian church. Because that Corinthian church, if you remember, it had a terrible scandal in it. And the hearts of the members of the Corinthian church were greatly distressed. And truth be told, there's nothing that can break people's hearts quite like a grievous church scandal can. It ranks right up there with a family scandal. And the church is supposed to be just one big family and not a dysfunctional family. We should view the church like a family because the interests of one are the interests of all, or at least they should be. And the least is to be looked after and loved just as well as the greatest. But that church at Corinth, it was the scene of a dire scandal. One of the worst scandals that the entire New Testament ever mentions. It was a scandal that had thrown that congregation into an upheaval. And the offender in the scandal, he had been withdrawn from. But the shame of it was in the mouths of the gossips and the busybodies of the city of Corinth. And Paul says, I recognize that. Paul says, I recognize the weight of all of that. When I was there before, I saw the gloomy side of things. When I was there before, I saw the clouds. But the next time I come, I'm determined I'm not going to let gloominess be the staple of my preaching there. I'm coming without any heaviness at all. Here's what he says. I determined this with myself, that I would not come again to you in heaviness. That's what he says to them in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 1. Paul saw the heaviness, but he says, I'm not coming with that this time. I did see the cause for the heaviness. He saw the tears, the gloom. He saw the depression and sorrow that was reigning there in the Corinthian church. And he said, but I'm going to not look at that. I'm going to look at the bright side of things. When I come back, I'm going to emphasize, he says, the things that are positive in that little sentence of our text. Beloved, Paul points out a very good lesson for every one of us. He points out a lesson that all of us need to conscientiously heed every day of our lives. Optimism should be the reigning habit of every human life. Now, I understand that it's difficult for some temperaments to be optimistic. But as a matter of conscience, as a matter of principle, as a matter of duty, as a matter of right and wisdom and happiness and usefulness, every human life should have the reigning habit of cheerful optimism. Preachers need to have that habit of optimism when they step into the pulpit to preach. For my part, I don't want to hear a preacher who has degenerated into a scolding, argumentative individual, and I don't want to be that guy. The preacher needs to have a habit of cheerfulness as he preaches the Word of God. Just like the physician should be cheerful as he ministers to his patients. The doctor that comes into your room with a long face is the forerunner of the hearse. And as God's people, we need to have our faces toward the morning. As God's people, we need to have our faces toward the sunshine. As God's people, we need to be singing, sunlight, sunlight in my soul today. Cheerfulness, optimism. That needs to be a fixed principle in my life and in your life. It's a duty. And there are some duties that we must not ignore. And it is everybody's duty to be cheerful. Sure, we have a duty to be honest, to be clean, to be pure, and to be kind. Whatever the sorrow and whatever the suffering, whatever the question, whatever the perplexity, to be cheerful is everybody's duty. And folks, we owe that to people we come in contact with. We owe it to everybody around us to go on our way singing. Now, that means that sometimes we have to sing through our tears. But if you look around you, all around us there are people who are fighting their battles. All around us there are people who are climbing their hills. They're facing their questions. They're grappling with their tasks. If cheerfulness is absent from our lives, we make their tasks and their lives harder and more difficult. You have no more right to unload a nasty temper, a pessimistic, wailing, grumbling temper and bad attitude on your brother or sister, battling alone with their tasks in life, than you have to bring a garbage can and dump it on your neighbor's front porch. A bad temper in the presence of others is nothing more than just plain bad manners. And to have a temper that's going to hurt other people, that is the epitome of selfishness. Honestly, we owe it to ourselves. And we owe it to each other to be cheerful. Our own self-interest calls for cheerfulness. You know what the wise man said in Proverbs 17:22? A merry heart doeth good like a medicine. A merry heart pours oil on the troubled waters of life. And we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to each other to cultivate a merry heart. That man or woman who is possessed of some of the most serious of life's purposes and problems and aims may also be that man or woman of the sunniest soul. We owe it to God to cultivate the habit of cheerfulness in our lives. Christianity is joyful. Back when Jesus was born, and the angel appeared to the shepherds who were guarding their flock, what did he say? Behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy that shall be to all people. That's in Luke chapter 2, verse 10. Christianity sees the bright light in the cloud. Christianity always has its face toward the morning. Paul wrote to the church of Philippi. He said, rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice. That's in Philippians 4, verse 4. Jesus declared that we are to be the light of the world, the sunshine of the world, the brightness of the world. Not the light of not the night of the world or the clouds of the world, but the light of the world. And when we allow ourselves to become so gloomy and so dark and so void of cheer, we give the world around us a world that's unregenerate, a world that's lost. We give them the impression that religion is morbid and gloomy and depressing. And the service of Jesus Christ and the religion of Jesus Christ is anything but gloomy and morbid and depressing. Cheerfulness. It ought to be a part of every life. I said it's a duty. But it's more than a duty. It's a privilege. It's a privilege to go with sunshine and music and cheerfulness through life. Now that doesn't mean the absence of seriousness. Absolutely not. The man in a world like ours who's not serious is a strange compound. Our world is a world that's battle-scarred. Our world is a world that's war-torn. To not be serious in a world like ours would be to be somewhat defective. But just as cheerfulness doesn't mean the absence of seriousness, seriousness does not mean the absence of cheerfulness. Being cheerful doesn't mean we're silly. Being cheerful doesn't mean we take a superficial view of life. If ever a man took a deep, masterful, comprehensive view of life, it was Paul. He saw all sides of life. He saw all conditions and facts. And seeing everything, he could remain cheerful. When he said, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice, he was in a prison when he wrote those words. We can't play the ostrich and put our heads in the sand. We can't say there's no troubles in our world. There are. We can't say there's no sickness. There is. It's touched all of our lives. We can't say there's no sorrows, no sin, no death. The pale horse and his rider have crossed all of our threshold at some point. To say that none of those things exist would be nothing short of madness. Sin is everywhere. Sickness is everywhere. Sorrow is everywhere. And death is everywhere. There are clouds. Our mission as God's people is to look for that bright light in the clouds. To look for that sunlight showing through the clouds. You see, Paul wrote in another place, I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Whatever the circumstances, whatever's going on, I've learned to be content in those circumstances. He also says, in everything give thanks. That's in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 18. Now notice what he did not say. He didn't say for everything give thanks. There's a lot of things that happen in our lives we're not thankful for. But he said, in everything give thanks. Whatever deep waters we're going through, we give thanks to God for His blessings upon us. When Paul wrote those words, when he said in everything give thanks, he was in jail when he wrote those words. Whatever comes, whatever the clouds, whatever the battle, whatever the sorrow, in everything give thanks. God can turn a battle back from the gate. God can turn the darkness of night into morning. Cheerfulness is a great privilege. It's high, it's holy, and it is a beauty. We've got to see life as it is, absolutely. Not, as I said, being cheerful, that's not being silly. That's not ignoring life. We've got to see that in life, for all of us, there are mountains we have to climb. There are streams that have to be bridged. There are tunnels we have to dig through craggy mountains. We have to see life as it is. And we have to see things as they are. But seeing everything as it is, we seek and we find the bright side of every situation. We need to make a high and infinitely wise resolve. A resolve that says, whatever comes, I'm going to live the sunny, cheerful, optimistic, victorious life for Jesus. We've got to make a deliberate, conscious decision that as God's children, as people who belong to Jesus Christ, We're going to be dispensers of cheerfulness. And we're going to be practitioners of helpfulness along the pathway of life. We've got to make the decision that we will be merchants of gladness and not merchants of gloom. That we're going to spread hope and not despair. When we do that, when we spread gladness instead of gloom and hope instead of despair, then we will be the light of the world and we will be the salt of power in our lives above ourselves. And we can't see the bright side of life until that change occurs. Thomas Chalmers expressed it this way: the expulsive power of a new affection. That's what we must have in our great battles of life. The great expulsive power, the great new affection that would expel sadness and gloom and darkness from our life, is the love for Jesus Christ. It is making Jesus Christ the Lord and Master of our lives. I think you've probably heard this once, maybe twice. If Jesus Christ is not Lord and Master of all of your life, Jesus Christ is not Lord and Master at all in your life. And here's the question: is He your Lord this morning? Is Jesus the ruling factor in your life? If Jesus is not Lord and Master of your life, then cheerfulness is going to be hard to come by. So maybe you've never made Him Lord and Master of your life. And if you need to do that, I'd beg you to do it before you leave this building. In simple, trusting faith, repenting of everything that's sin in your life, confessing His name, and being buried in baptism for the remission of past sins. Or maybe you've done that, but you haven't lived with Jesus as your Lord and your Master. That's been seen, and you need to come back and let brothers and sisters pray with you and for you. I don't know what's going on in your life. I don't know what your needs might be, but if there are needs in your life that we can help you with, this is your opportunity to come and let those needs be made known.